I'm extremely happy and extremely honored to have Professor Andrew Cole here from English Department of Princeton University and director of Gauss Seminar in Criticism. His work is really interesting. He comes from the field of medieval studies. He's a notable scholar of Chaucer. The title of the book is Literature and Heresy in the Age of Chaucer. So I think it's a fantastic book. But the point that I want to, the book that I want to specifically mention here is his Birth of Theory, published in 2014 with Chicago University Press, which is a wonderful attempt at coming to Hegel from the medieval background, explaining medieval authors like Plotinus as the background of Hegel's Dialectics of Negativity and Difference. It's a wonderful book, and I would absolutely recommend it to everyone who's ever heard of Hegel. This is what I would say. But I would also like to add a personal note and say that yes, that Andrew Cole is also a drummer who comes from the not the province, how do you call them, state of Georgia. So that'd be one thing to call it. All right, the state of Georgia, right? Not the province of Georgia. And he's simply one of the nicest people that I have ever met. And it also gives me a personal pleasure to be the one introducing you to our crowd. So please, Andrew, talk to us.
By the term figure in the title to this talk, I mean to say I'm sorry. I do not mean the figures that mostly populate Hegel's great aesthetics, which are the occasion that brings us here. You see, the figures in Hegel's aesthetics are almost invariably bodies, big bodies in the likes of the statues of Greek and Roman deities, smaller bodies in the likes of the body of Christ, whose incarnation brings the Godhead down to approachably, huggably, human-sized proportions, naked bodies as seen in statues of ancient and Renaissance art, and of course, bodies as seen on the very first plate, on the very first page of the English edition, which is a full frontal of Silenus holding the infant Bacchus. I'm not sure what the editors are up to by including this plate, though obviously Hegel was obsessed with Bacchus. However much Hegel sound bit himself in the phenomenology of spirit in saying that, quote, the true is the bacchanalian whirl in which no member is not drunken, he mellowed out a bit on this point in his aesthetics when he says, quote, fine art acquires from the spirit's point of view a summons to bridle the emotions themselves as well as their expression, so that there is no being carried away into a bacchanalian rage or whirling tumult of passions, end quote. It is therefore no surprise to hear Hegel say in the Aesthetics that clothed bodies, bodies with clothes, are just as good, just as beautiful as naked ones, because clothing subtly reveals the fine proportions of the person beneath, the posture, and so forth. Yet the real problem with these bodily figures goes beyond Hegel's decorum about body parts. Rather, these figures, these particular human bodies and statuary and pictorial forms conceal a deeper problem, namely that beneath those clothes and within every bodily figure is an unsexy and lifeless geometric figure. And this goes for most art. It is the task of the artist, as Hegel says, to render the geometric figure from inorganic forms to organic forms, whether it's a sculptor chiseling away at a square marble block, or a painter brushing onto the canvas the unsymmetrical forms very different from the straight lines or grids of linear perspective, which as an artistic technique risks becoming, as Hegel puts it, quote, a purely geometrical science. It's purely geometrical if it's done poorly, which is to say, when it's done obviously. Once the artist renders the figure in the geometric sense into a figure in the bodily or gestural sense, we have art. This is because, according to Hegel, the body beyond its lines and proportions discloses a certain content not reducible to these bare geometric forms, a content that expresses an inner life, feeling, and soul. Those are all words that Hegel uses. This, quote, is just what we call the significance of a work of art. On the one hand, you can see that the significance of art lies in sculpture on through to poetry, lies in its content. As Hegel says, for through sculpture the spirit should stand before us in blissful tranquility in its bodily form, and in immediate unity therewith, and the form should be brought to life by the content of spiritual individuality, end quote. On the other hand, you can understand that the insignificance of geometrical figuration lies in its rigid formalism, rote regularity, and symmetry, what Hegel calls, quote, a mere lifeless geometrical unity that cannot possibly exhaust the nature of a work of art, end quote. Oh, look, there's a triangle on the wall. Is it art? Is it religion? Is it information? Your guess is as good as mine, and as good as Hegel's. Hegel says, quote, we ourselves may not in all circumstances determine with the same assurance whether a triangle is to be considered a triangle proper as a symbol. No, there is no art to geometric figures, just as there's no eye whose gleam shines forth the inner light from the geometric figure. Sorry about that. Well, we're going to talk about that in a second. You could say that there's no concept to such geometrical figures. Now that would be a broader point, no concept to geometric figures. And it would be a more difficult one to make, but it would also be a point we're gathered here to consider, namely Hegelian conceptuality. To say that there's no concept to geometric figures is a broader point because it includes most all of Hegel's other writings. Geometric figures have a rather curiously central place in his writings, ranging from the phenomenology of spirit, his two logics, the philosophy of right, on into his philosophy of nature. Rest assured, Hegel still dislikes figures in these works too. Figures for him are just a bunch of lines and numbers, annoyingly uncommitted to either thought or being. He dislikes figures because they aren't language, or are an idiom, a medium, that's not the language of spirit. But Hegel also can't leave figures well enough alone, and this is what I will discuss today. He continuously refers to figures in order to make a point, only a few sentences later to change his mind, not so much about the point, but about the figurative example itself and the limitations of figurative thinking. What's more, and you might call this the kicker, he frequently refers to figures and says deeply dialectical things about them, but does so in an unself-conscious way, which would seem to be a patently and surprisingly undialectical thing for him to do, right? But even the best sometimes nod at the wheel of dialectics. Above all, what Hegel doesn't seem to know, or better, what he doesn't seem to know he is demonstrating in his figurative examples, is that figures are concepts by other means. That figures are sometimes more powerful demonstrations of dialectical thinking and dialectical imagining than are concepts themselves. Figures sometimes seem to illustrate the point about conceptual thinking and the motility and dynamism of concepts better than concepts themselves. I don't know entirely the reason why Hegel doesn't push his thinking farther to see this point for himself, but I think the reason may have to do with the thrust of his own dialectical exposition, which impels us to move quickly from figure to concept, as if to insist upon the lesson that picture thinking, or Vorstellung, must be superseded by conceptual thinking, that art and religion must make way for philosophy, and that's that, and let's get on with it, and get these figures out of here. But I would suggest that there's some value to lingering here in the encounter between figures and concepts. In order to examine the relationship between the two, if for no other reason than to understand why Hegel would memorably depict the totality of his grand philosophy using, of all things, a figure. To boot, a figure that we may picture and that Hegelians have actually set out to draw in their books and articles. I refer to his famous circle of circles, which is a geometric figure Hegel selects to characterize his encyclopedic enterprise rather than choosing, say, some concept to draw everything together, something equally strange we haven't heard before. And here we might note that absolute knowledge is not that concept, absent as it is of its discipline or object, that though absolute spirit is obviously involved in the various modes, art, religion, and philosophy, which is where we must dwell. As I proceed, it'll be clear that I'm less interested in the reasons why Hegel can't come fully to terms with his figurative thinking, and am rather more interested in the sheer fact that his work everywhere evinces equivocation about figures. Hegel is an interruption in intellectual history, both of his own making and that which comes before him. On the one hand, figuration is an issue that the later Hegelian traditions, called Marxism, would try to address in various ways, from Marx's little-studied work on calculus, to Jameson's thinking on cognitive mapping, and perhaps to the entire project to describe a spatialized dialectic in which spatial forms are its central generative figure and whose realization appears in architecture first and foremost, which is of course where Hegel himself begins in his aesthetics, noting that with the Egyptian pyramids, quote, there enters the line proper as well as regularity and abstract geometrical forms, unquote. The line proper reshapes, quote, organic nature into a structure that's mathematical, unquote. On the other hand, before Hegel stands a vigorous tradition of geometrical thinking that precedes his conceptual project by millennia, which means that there are plenty of resources by which to do dialectical work with figuration, if you care to do this at all. Hegel, in seeking to interrupt or close shut a tradition of figurative speculation, cannot in fact do so, not even in his own writing. This is because when he discloses even the slightest interest in figures, he perforce adopts those figures to dialectics. My task now, after this long pre-ramble, is to discuss how geometric figuration informs not only Hegel's thinking, but his very ideas about thinking. That is, his propositions about what thought fundamentally is. On this question of thinking, we remember what he said in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit about his effort, quote, to bring fixed thoughts into a fluid state, unquote, so that we can apprehend the quote-unquote dialectical form. In the time I have here, I want to explore this idea about the fluidity and motion of thought and ask how might figures count as dialectical form. And I shall do this not by tracking the movement of the concept, as we are wont to do in reading Hegel's expositions as fundamentally narratives, but instead follow the development and animation of the figure and the kinds of imaginative activity geometrical figuration invites us to perform. I will suggest that figures are an image of thought that's not static but dynamic. A dialectical image in a sense slightly different from Walter Benjamin's, whose dialectical image is famously at a standstill, but bursting with temporality at the moment of dialectical becoming. Figures, rather, are figures of thought because they move, just as thinking and the dialectic itself must move. Figures never fall into static picture thinking, Vorstellung, or one-sidedness. Figures in some both initiate and image the movement of thought. And so we would be right to call them dialectical and a central component of Hegel's philosophy, whether Hegel likes it or not. Okay, so this section is called the Circle of Dialectics. To talk about figures is to know their difference from concepts. And to know this difference, we should discuss some of what makes Hegel distinct from Kant. This is a Hegel conference after all, so let's look at a snippet of what Hegel says about his predecessor, in particular, his comments on common Kantian terminology like the Transcendent. In his Encyclopedia of Logic, Hegel writes, quote, "The transcendent here is, quite generally, whatever goes beyond the determinacy of the understanding, and in this sense it occurs first in mathematics. For instance, it is said in geometry that one must imagine the circumference of a circle to consist of an infinite number of infinitely small straight lines. Determinations that count as utterly diverse for the understanding, straight line and curve, are expressly posited here as identical." You can see the distinction here between the work of the understanding and that of the imagination. As Hegel never hesitates to say throughout his works, the understanding, Verstand, is fixed and one-sided. Likewise, the concepts of the understanding, to be Kantian about it, can't compute what they can't compute. Plurality under the heading of quantity in the table of categories doesn't do the conceptual work of causality and dependence under the heading of relation. Likewise, in the basic figurative terms in this quotation, and this will get more complicated in a minute, the concept of a line can't compute what comes at you as a circle, and that of a circle can't compute what comes at you as a line or as a square. The fabled square circle, in other words, will never appear within experience because it's not out there nor in here. Go beyond the understanding, however, and the determinations of understanding, and you have to start imagining. To take our quotation as the example, you have to imagine that the circumference of a circle, what you know from books to be a circle in pure space, is composed of figures that aren't circular at all. It's a circle whose circumference is all lines. And when we imagine the circumference to be made of lines, we begin to do the dialectical work of identity and difference. As Hegel says, characteristics which the understanding holds to be totally different, the straight line and curve, are expressly invested with identity, end quote. Hegel is also saying that something like this figure can appear, if provisionally, not in the understanding, but in the imagination, where, again, to our quotation, one must imagine the circumference of a circle to consist of an infinite number of infinitely small straight lines. How might you do this? How might you imagine this or figure this in your head? You can mathematize the damn thing in various ways, calculating the sum of angles of any given polygon, which is the formula 180 times the sum of the number of sides minus 2. Or you can calculate the number of diagonals in that polygon by the formula 1/2 the number of sides times the sum of the number of sides minus 2. Or you can find its area, 1/2 the sum of the length of the sides of the polygon times the distance from the center to the midpoint, and so forth for each iteration, each additional side, up to infinity. Are you getting the picture? Or you can do the following visualization that eventually strains the capacity of the imagination. In this, you can watch it go. You see the polygon shrinking its sides to approximate what's represented in Cartesian space, a pure circle. And as the polygon approaches pure circularity, you can see that we get closer and closer to pi, to 3.14. Here's another way of looking at it from the inside. This is the figure and the mathematical function of integral calculus Hegel has in mind. It's not a figure that's static. It's a figure that is in motion and must be in motion because it's a figure in transition. It's a figure that is becoming. The smaller the lines get, the more sides the polygon has, the bigger it grows into its form, the closer to the circumference of the unit circle as pi, or 3.14, you get. Though this won't ever stop, because pi is an irrational number whose decimal places can be carried out infinitely. You can picture this figure up to a point until the imagination gives out. And when that happens, when the imagination gives out, we can turn back to Kant and then to Hegel. Now for Kant, there's no constitutive concept for this particular shape, because it's shuttling between one concept and another, an ever-changing mathematical object. In his critique of pure reason, for example, Kant believes in this thing he calls the schematism of pure understanding. And note here the old Greek schema, which is often translated as figure, and which means that Kant thinks figurally as well. The schema of the understanding provide the image before the image, or rather the figure before the image. The, quote, pure geometrical concept of a circle that subtends the empirical concept of a plate, unquote. Kant is talking about pure figures in space, is his phrase. The sphere that helps you perceive the billiard ball, the triangle that helps you stagger toward a slice of greasy pizza. Even if the two are not congruent to each other, the plate may have a chipped edge, the pizza may be missing a slice. There's enough overlap for the understanding to get the picture and make a judgment that this plate, this pizza, can rightly be said to be circular. This is an important feature of Kant's schematism of the understanding, in which disadequation, incongruence, is accepted as a tolerance, but then tossed to the side. As Kant says, quote, images can be connected with the concept only by means of the schema, the figures to which they belong. In themselves, they are never completely congruent with the concept, unquote. And so indeed, disadequation, the misfit, simply falls out during cognition, lost somewhere in what Kant calls that, quote, art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover and to have open to our gaze, unquote. When difference disappears, the fluid and imperfect figure is hardened into a concept. The figure freezes and is no longer in motion. And who likes frozen pizza, after all? Sometimes it'll do, just as sometimes Kant will do. And in this freezing, we lose a certain dynamic between figures and concepts that I believe animates Hegel's own thinking, or even irritates him as he is thinking. In fact, you can see this distinction between figure and concept quite clearly in Kant's modest tract of 1790, called, quote, on a discovery whereby any new critique of pure reason is made to be superfluous by an older one, unquote. In this text, Kant pauses to speak first of Archimedes and his description of a 96-sided polygon, which philosophers chose, along with the chiliagon, to make salient the tension between picturing and mathematization. Okay, here's Kant. Now, when Archimedes describes a polygon of 96 sides around a circle, did he or did he not ground his concept of the above-mentioned regular polygon on an intuition? He inevitably did so, not in that he actually drew it, which would be an unnecessary and absurd demand. I mean, who would do drawing? I mean, God. But rather in that he knew the rule for the construction of his concept, and hence that he could determine its magnitude as closely to that of the object itself as he wished, and could give it an intuition in accordance with the concept, and thereby demonstrated the reality of the rule itself, and likewise that of this concept, for the use of the imagination. It's not that Archimedes drew it, because, again, that would be absurd. I mean, who would bother with drawing? Rather, and I'm joking there, rather it's that he knew it. Archimedes knew it. And in this knowing, he automatically grounded in intuition those impossible to imagine and hard to draw complex polygons, basically rendering them as objects of experience. How on earth do you make of something an object of experience that isn't in experience? Kant's answer is that this polygon is only given to intuition as an object of experience because the concept is at once the mathematical object. The concept is at once the figure. Again, Archimedes knew the rule for the construction of his concept, and hence that he could determine its magnitude as closely to that of the object itself as he wished. And he could give it an intuition in accordance with the concept, and thereby demonstrated the reality of the rule itself. End quote. Here you can see that there is no approximation, no approaching of limits. The figure isn't a product of the imagination, but rather it is a concept of the understanding. The figure is turned into a concept, but even more, it is now an a priori form of experience in the way Kant claims Archimedes works backwards from regulative concept to constitutive concept. You can't do this when thinking about or experiencing art. As we learn in the third critique, though those purposive forms in the likes of a nautilus's interior of spiraling chambers is another matter. Hegel, however, will let figures be figures, while freeing them to do conceptual and dialectical work. In the Encyclopedia Logic, he talks of circles in relation to that signal logical form, namely identity and difference, which is not one concept, but two, what we would call a determinative concept. Here he questions the difference between the concept of a circle and the appearance of circularity given off by something that's like a circle, but is not actually a circle, if we abide by Plato's definition of likeness as a kind of difference. Hegel writes, since it is forgotten that identity and opposition are themselves opposed, and we will see who is doing this forgetting in a minute, the principle of opposition is taken also for the principle of identity in the form of the principle of contradiction. And a concept to which neither or both of two mutually contradictory characteristics apply is declared to be logically false, like, for instance, a square circle. Now, although a polygonal circle or rectilinear arc contradicts this principle just as much, geometers do not hesitate to consider and to treat the circle as a polygon with rectilinear sides. But something like a circle, its mere determinacy, is not yet a concept. Something that's not a circle, but that is like a circle, is not yet a concept. In the concept of circle, center and periphery are equally essential. Both characteristics belong to it, and yet periphery and center in the figure, let's say, are opposed to and contradict each other. Who is doing the forgetting here but the geometers? But what are they forgetting is what Hegel can't seem to remember himself in his famous revisions to the laws of identity, that identity and opposition are in fact not always opposed. So the geometers here are right, though Hegel says they are wrong to think identity and contradiction. They are right to think about, on the one hand, the hard and fast concept of the circle, whereby center and periphery are equally essential on the basis of circumference equals 2 pi r. And on the other hand, they are correct, quote, to treat the circle as a polygon with rectilinear sides, unquote. What is the concept here in this second figure? This polygon with rectilinear sides? There isn't one, as Hegel says. Again, something like a circle is not yet a concept. This is a fine distinction between Kant and Hegel, but it shows that Hegel won't give up and say that the figure gets swallowed by the concept. Its difference tolerated but eliminated. He will only say that no, this figure is no concept. All the while, he encourages us to think deeply figuratively and potentially dialectically. Hegel avoids mistaking a figure for a concept, not because he wants to protect or celebrate figuration, or that he cares very much about mathematical language. For example, while he experiments with Euclidean geometric formulae and basic functions in trigonometry, he is peevish about limits in integral and differential calculus. In the science of logic, for example, he says, it is the geometricians, especially, whose constant concern is to conceptualize the approximation of a magnitude to its limit, and who insist on stressing this aspect of the difference of quantum from quantum, that it is not a difference and yet it is. But all the same, approximation is by itself a category that says nothing and conceptualizes nothing. Three things are odd and therefore interesting about this passage. This dismissal of the possibility of conceptualizing nothing. First, it's strange that Hegel takes this position, sounding Kantian and poo-pooing approximation. Hegel, one would think, is perfectly capable of conceptualizing approximation as a species of surplus. We would assume he could teach us something about gaps, about the spaces between, and tell us about those sums that are not greater than, but lesser than, the total of their parts. Indeed, such disadequations, gaps, is how negativity often appears, how it shows up as a determinate quality. Second, Hegel's position is odd here because he speaks of a quantum in a patently dialectical way that abides by the very dialectical law of identity difference. As he says, of the quantum, it is and is not difference. In other words, it's puzzling that he finds this situation to be bad, this effort to conceptualize approximation, this wish to think nothing, when that effort seems to conform to the way he rewrites the laws of identity via his well-known claims about identity and difference, or what he says in the doctrine of essence about being, nothing, and becoming. Third, it's not as if Hegel eschews thinking about limits elsewhere. Sure, he doesn't like limits when proposed in strictly mathematical terms, but he seems to change his mind when he talks about limits in relation to what Marx, Engels, Trotsky, Lenin, Bukharin regarded as a tried and true dialectical law, or as Marx says in the first volume of Capital, quote, "Here, as in natural science, is shown the correctness of the law discovered by Hegel in his logic, that merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative changes." He's right. Hegel, for his part, uses the dialectical terms of quantity-quality to say that everything has a limit in terms of what it is and can be, spatially and temporally, beyond which point an entity becomes something else altogether. It's a logic of transformation, of change, as Hegel says in his Science of Logic. If by limit we understand one which is quantitative, and for instance, a field alters its limit in this sense, the field goes from 1 acres to 3 acres, say, then the field remains a field just as before. If on the contrary, it is the qualitative limit of the field which is altered, what is altered is a determination that makes the field a field, and the field then becomes a meadow, a forest, and so on. Limits are what we think, and they are part of what it means to do phenomenology. We clearly see here Hegel's meaning. A field is a field by our terms, whether it's quantitatively 1 or 3 acres, but if the field becomes a forest over time, it is qualitatively something else, and the old determinations no longer hold. It is no longer a field. You can see how Hegel packs quantity into quality. You can also hear Eubulides of Miletus in the background, not his paradox of the heap or his paradox of the bald man, but rather, let's call it the paradox of the forest. Precisely what minimum quantity of trees must there be to qualify a field as a forest? This is limit thinking. This is indeed a kind of calculus as we mean in colloquial terms. So it's strange again to discover that Hegel won't entertain this mode of thinking when it comes to figuration, that moment when the infinitely sided polygon approaches circularity at the instant the sides shrink to get ever closer to a pure circle. I would call this a contradiction in his own thinking, and dare I say it's what makes his work dialectical in ways even Hegel himself didn't even grasp. The point here so far is that Hegel likes and dislikes figures. He ranks figures beneath concepts, but then turns around and does all kinds of dialectical things with figures that are often far cooler, far neater than his illustrations, stories, and content-oriented flip-flops about the concept or Geist. And don't get me started about his famous illustration in the Encyclopedia Logic about the circle of circles, which is the preeminent figure for his entire philosophical system. And yet there he goes, figuring his philosophy with a geometrical figure, the circle of circles. Or rather, get me started. So this section is called a circle of circles. How can we not discuss this figure? Because it is the figure for his entire philosophical project, or at least the project that goes by the name of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. In the foreword to the Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel writes, "Each of the parts of philosophy is a philosophical whole, a circle that closes upon itself. But in each of them, the philosophical idea is in a particular determinacy or element. Every single circle also breaks through the restrictions of its element as well, precisely because it is inwardly the totality and grounds a wider sphere. The whole presents itself, therefore, as a circle of circles, each of which is a necessary moment, so that the system of its particular elements constitutes the whole idea, which equally appears in each single one of them." This is one of the more widely cited passages from Hegel. But let's admit it, he's royally screwing up here. He's adopting a thoroughly figural language to make the most lofty and serious claims about his philosophical system in relation to the other disciplines. Of course, those disciplines, call them approaches if you prefer, because you're interested in the history of the university or something like that, are also part of his philosophy in more general terms. The whole circle of thought coursed through in the Encyclopedia Logic, which is literally one circle right there after the Greek enkyklaios paideia. Figures are Hegel's best way of thinking in this passage. We can go down the checklist. He shows the circle as a point in motion. The aforementioned circle is self-closing. In other words, which Hegel says, as if to emphasize that the process by which a circle is made is what we should be thinking, asking us to follow the circular motion of the point rather than necessarily seeing at one glance the completed image of a circle as we would in an illustration book, a gathering of hippies, or anything by Kant. Hegel will never speak of a circle without talking about movement, which is what makes his circles a figure rather than a symbol or static image. In the Science of Logic, whence this figure springs, he tells of, quote, a circle that winds around itself, where the mediation winds the end back to the beginning, which is the simple ground. In the Philosophy of Nature, he contemplates circular mechanics. But here's the cool thing about this circular figuration, about this figuration of his philosophy in circular terms. This circle, or better, this moving point that constructs a circle, breaks through the restrictions of its elements as well, precisely because it is inwardly the totality and establishes a wider sphere. Or as a popular alternative translation has it, the circle bursts through the limits imposed by its special medium and gives rise to a wider circle. One thing at a time. First, the circle breaks from its elements. What does this mean, elements? This is a very common word in Hegel's writing, but here it has a very specific meaning. Hegel has done us the favor of thinking rigorously figuratively, guiding us in the interpretation of this word. We shouldn't construe its element as a reference to some kind of Empedoclean medium or as some substance, like Anaxagoras' ether. Rather, Hegel is referring to the older Greek sense of elements, or stoicheia, meaning, among other things, principles or rules. The rule of the circle, its element on the coordinate plane, is the equation of the circle, x squared plus y squared equals r squared. But the rule needn't be only expressed in the symbols of math. The rule can be words that make you picture things in your mind, as we see in Euclid's Elements, appropriately titled Elements. Euclid writes, quote, "A circle is a plane figure contained by one line such that all straight lines falling upon it from one point among those lying within the figure are equal to one another." Such was the language of mathematics before the symbolic system of Diophantus of Alexandria. You had to write sentences like this to picture things. Many early mathematical manuscripts lacked illustrations, so you had to have the words guide you in the picturing of the figures. And it's always interesting, too, when you go through Hegel's aesthetics, he also leaves out the figures and the editors put them in, because we have to see the damn triangle. We have to look at the circle. I think that's taking the fun out of it, however. So those are the elements of the circle, its rules in Euclidean terms. But what of the breakthrough? Hegel shows us when he figures this so-called breakthrough as a transition to a new and different figure we're meant to observe. The figurative motion we're meant to think and imagine. As we learn in this passage, the circle breaks from its element, or what we would generally say, the point deviates from its circular pattern to produce not a wider circle, but a wider sphere. This wider sphere is the new figure that pictures the movement to totality that is philosophy. Other readings of the circle of circles will continue to be important in the interpretation of Hegel. You can tell there's a footnote there. And there will always be drawings of this passage in books, but it is indeed interesting to think of this totality as a sphere, because it is quite simply compelling to think of the figure as a sphere itself. Thinking elementally, you can say a sphere is comprised of an infinite number of points, all equidistant from the center. Or you could cite Euclid, who, in gathering the wisdom of the ancient mathematicians in his Elements, describes a sphere as a semicircle spun round its diameter. Again, this is when you start reading the pre-modern mathematical texts. The illustrations are always those that require you to think a figure in motion. Or you can simply spin a whole planar circle around the line drawn by any two diametrically opposed points. A sphere is, in short, a circle made of circles, or if you will, parts of circles, which are, to follow Hegel's figural thinking here, incomplete and more limited in their own right in relation to the greater spherical figure, just as the individual sciences in relation to the whole are a part of the entirety of the philosophical science. Now, what I'm showing you here is an animation of how you calculate the volume of a sphere. But the principle by which you calculate the volume of the sphere is, again, based on an idea that a figure is in motion, that the volume of the sphere is only calculated by the movement of a circle, in this case following, well, I'll explain a little bit later in trigonometric functions. But as the illustration is demonstrating, a circle generated along every point down the y-axis. Here's another version of this, again, based on the idea of the right triangle, which is, again, reminding one, again, of the ideas of motion that are inherent in determining volume, but also the fact that the right triangle, as Pythagoras teaches, is essential in determining volumes of the sphere to begin with. Okay? And then here's some other stuff that I just think is cool. It's like the Death Star pictured in the X-Wing as you're flying towards it. Yeah, look at that. Circle of circles, baby. A sphere is, in short, a circle made of circles, or if you will, the parts of circles, which are, to follow Hegel's figural thinking here, incomplete, and again, limited in their own right in relation to the greater spherical figure, just as are the individual sciences limited in relation to the entire philosophical science. And that whole, that spherical totality, is a differently dimensional figure than a mere circle in one dimension from the point of view of the moving point, or two dimensions if we're talking about this point as coordinates on a plane. The pure sphere is in two dimensions from the point of view of the moving point traveling about its surface, or skin, but give the sphere volume and it's in three dimensions. And this is this opening up of thinking into dimensions that this entire figure allows you to do, and which thinking of the circle of circles as some kind of stupid symbol does not allow you to do. Of course, this looks like just another example for the infinite, the many within the one, but as a figure for facing the facts of a situation, indeed a figure that is calculable and mutable, it is frankly to be preferred to an infinity that amounts to astral escapism, or to a multiplicity with no organization at any level, or again, to stupid symbolism. This section is called Circles of Movement. I like this one better because it's kind of 80s looking. It's got some nostalgia to it. Figures make us think differently then. And one thing they make us think, according to Hegel, is thinking itself as motion. But the problem is not only that thought moves, as if saying this point umpteen times means we're doing Hegelian philosophy, as if pointing out that Hegel draws a sphere has any significance beyond static picture thinking or Vorstellung. What makes these figures different from images, and in Kant they aren't different, what makes Figuren different from Bilder, different from symbols and the perennial problems of their meaning, is that they require us to think movement, just as they require Hegel to write a figure for the movement of thought that is itself a figure in motion. I suggest that such figurations give meaning to the very notion of a dialectical text. If indeed this is an idea worth contemplating, and I would note there's a robust tradition for thinking about what constitutes dialectical texts, dialectical sentences, dialectical images, and so on, then we would want to look out for those moments in Hegel's writing, those examples in his work, where there is a certain figural intensity or figural break, a place in his writing where he indulges the figure and thinks it through, only to pop back out of that mode and resume his exposition as if nothing ever happened. These moments are few and far between, but they are worth noting, if for no other reason than such passages exercise our minds in the ways we as an animal have forgotten to do. Before our own moment in modernity, if I may wildly generalize, one could think movement and visualize the animation of shapes morphing into other shapes by dint of mathematics, be it basic geometry and trigonometry, or even introductory calculus. I don't see how a dialectician could resist speaking dialectically about such mathematical functions. We've seen the examples already, but perhaps my favorite, and it will be my last, comes in his philosophy of nature, where Hegel refers to mathematical functions in his discussion of the quote-unquote higher definition of the circle. A higher definition of the circle than that based on the equality of the radii is that which takes account of the difference in it, and so reaches complete determinateness of the circle. This occurs in the analytic treatment of the circle, which contains nothing but what is found in Pythagoras' theorem. The other two sides are sine and cosine, or abscissa and ordinate. The hypotenuse is the radius. The relationship of these three is the determinateness of the circle, not simple as in the first definition, but a relation of differentiated elements. Again, I read this as dialectical language, but Hegel never seems to notice or want to make much of it, this talk of relations of difference, of the difference within, and so forth. For example, you get determination, that is a circle, when you have difference, as we would expect, but the difference is that triangles are fundamentally parts of circles. most rudimentarily, right triangles. A triangle, in other words, with 90 degrees as one of its angles. It's a straightforward idea in trigonometry that expresses the profound affinity between the Pythagorean theorem, that is a squared plus b squared equals c squared for the right triangle, and the equation for the circle, that is x squared plus y squared equals r squared. In the identity of the circle is the difference of the triangle, but both are mutually determinative only if we understand the very trigonometric functions, sine and cosine, that effectively draw circles by dint of the rotating radius that is also the hypotenuse of the right triangle. Words, words, words. What I mean is that we can only see and imagine this identity and difference if we see and think the figure in motion. And this is the relationship of the triangle to the circle. And this is what the sine and cosine functions inherently are. Again, they are motions, they are ever-changing ratios. To go further in this thought, we can imagine identity and difference by recalling that this geometry in motion wasn't about gifts, but was in fact what it meant in antiquity to do geometry, whereby you walk in patterns, including circles, using ropes staked to the ground, pulling and winding the ropes around stakes to make shapes and change shapes and their ratios, as did the Egyptian Harpodonti depicted in 18th dynasty art. These are the land surveyors who calculated lengths using the right triangles we now describe as Pythagorean triples. In sum, and this is the conclusion, I want to claim that Hegel supplies a figurative philosophy that parallels his thinking about concepts, their capacities, limits, motions, and interrelations with other concepts, even though Hegel himself is loath to draw this parallel. Figures are conceptuality by other means, I suggest, and as I've tried to show, they change and morph in the way concepts do. Figures are composed of other figures, and concepts are composed of other concepts, themselves never emerging as stable forms of possible experience. In this way, figures picture and initiate the movement of thought. They do both at once. Speaking of picturing, however, we see a difficulty arise, and a different parallel indeed. I could look at this all day. Damn. Figures, that is, remind us of what Hegel in his section on revealed religion and the phenomenology of spirit calls picture thinking, or what's translated as picture thinking, or Vorstellung, often also translated as presentation. The problem of Vorstellung being, among other things, that it's like the understanding. It is fixed. In this case, in its own terms, a static or motionless image, typically a ritual symbol. We are familiar with the passage. However, it came as a shock to me to realize that Hegel speaks of modern calculus as if it were exactly like religion in the way, quote, higher mathematics falls back on pictorial representation, he says, or Vorstellung, which is a less perfect means of representation to bother oneself with, unquote. It is an extraordinary claim, and not the best parallel to make, I believe. At any rate, it's not clear that everyone got the memo that we should avoid or move beyond Vorstellung, for it remains a key phenomenological approach to images as broadly other, even if the language of otherness is now quite antiquated in fields like critical race studies. Still, as Hegel reminds us in the final chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, picture thinking is, quote, the form of otherness for self-consciousness, unquote. I would say in this, my final paragraph, that Hegel wants figurative thinking to himself. He wants it to himself. He wants to do it, but doesn't want to integrate it within dialectics. He practices figurative thinking as if he were doing mental exercises not unlike those of logic, which he curiously praises in the first volume on logic in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. There he writes, quote, the logic is the most difficult science, inasmuch as it has to do not with sensible intuitions, nor even, like geometry, with abstract sense representations, but with pure abstractions. It requires, logic that is, a trained ability at withdrawing into pure thought, holding on to it, and moving within it. End quote. I call this quotation curious because Hegel hastens to name geometry here, when he needn't need to name it at all if he really didn't care much for it. But he does name it, and it's because he has to. It's the closest competitor logic has in this effort to think thinking. As he says, quote, logic consists in one's becoming proficient in thinking, since this is the science of thinking, and in one's coming to have thoughts in one's head, and to know them also as thoughts. Logic may not be like geometry, but geometry is sometimes like logic. And concepts may not be like figures, but figures are sometimes like concepts. In truth, which is always somewhere in between, I would call figures dialectical images requiring the work of the dialectical imagination. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for firing us up with this great lecture and presentation, which I shall call mildly provocative. But let's see. I want to immediately open the floor to questions and comments. I must warn you that I have very many, so if I don't see people raising hands, I will have to speak, and I will gladly do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for this really wonderful talk. And I think I sympathize a lot with the project that I think is kind of leading it, inspiring it. But I have perhaps it's just that I don't quite understand these things so well. But particularly in the first part, when you were using this, illustrating this, how in mathematics renderings of a geometrical identity of the opposite of the square and of the circle, via the question of approximation and the whole question of the gap and of the limit. Actually, I was wondering whether I think Hegel's response would be approximation is all about elimination of the gap. It is not about its containment or its conceptualization. So approximating the limit is for him opposite of the logic of the change to some extent, because to change it's already to be on the other side. I mean, you have to make the move. It's not if you just remain at endlessly approaching the limit, which is one notion of the limit, as opposed to the one I think you quoted from Marx, and where you have this shift precisely from quantity to quality. Then there is this kind of, and I think this is basically related to Hegel's whole discussion of bad infinity as opposed to the true infinity, which again brings us back to the question of the circle and whether this is the right topology. Some suggested like Möbius strip as the topology of this. So, but I think there is this, perhaps this paradox that, or I can see the reason why for Hegel precisely, as opposed to Kant, why he rejected the logic of approximation, of kind of drawing near the thing without ever kind of getting there. So to say.
That's terrific, and thank you for that. I would say, I would put it this way. If Hegel meant what he's doing here in rejecting approximation, then the phenomenology of spirit would be 10 pages long and not 500. That is a text with a kind of uneven pacing and tempo. It moves rapidly in some instances in transitions that take a very long time. It moves very quickly in transitions that are inexplicable and that occur in what Plato would call the instant or the leap, when something suddenly becomes something else. One can think of the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness, as Robert Pippin points out, as one such sudden transformation, which indeed eliminates approximation. But there are other passages in the phenomenology of spirit where they are the analog to what I think is approximation, the analog that is in narrative terms. And so what I mean to say here is that approximation is something that can be practiced in language, which is the medium of spirit, as Hegel says in the phenomenology of spirit, but it's something that can't be practiced in the figurative thinking. And to me, those two things should be sorted out and make sense. You either enjoy figurative approximation and write a very long text called the Phenomenology of Spirit for 400 pages, or you eliminate approximation and write a very short text. That's not the Phenomenology of Spirit, would be how I would look at that. It's really, to me, a question about what you can do in language and in narrative and what you can do in figurative thinking. That's
I see your point. I think my way of seeing phenomenology is not as a kind of enjoying in approximation, but also this kind of constantly being already over the, I mean, what kind of drives phenomenology is that already the first step, it's like Achilles and tortoise, you know, it's already with the first step he is kind of passes over it. So, and the whole reflection, the whole thing, and the whole image of the whole, it's precisely, you only retrospectively get to learn and reflect upon what just happened there.
yes.
So it's not that you are, I mean, so in the sense I see what you mean, is there is this movement which seemingly never ends, but what drives it, it's somehow that you are already there, or something like that.
That's not coming at you. I wanted to... Yeah, that's my response. No, let's get it back to this. Okay, so you see this? When we use pi and when we conceptualize pi, we don't go through the whole proof every time. That's why we have a mathematical language where there are things called givens. And we know these givens because we've been through the proofs and have a shorthand. I really, crazily enough, believe that this experience of reading Hegel, where the transition, where this problem of retrospection is understood, is again the analogy for not deriving the proof of pi as the circumference of a unit circle with a radius of 1. If you had to do this every time you spoke of pi, we wouldn't be, well, we're not flying to the moon now, for God's sake, but we wouldn't be able to do anything in terms of these kinds of calculations. I really think that our experience of retrospection, or of the kind of always already, or that moment that's kind of set up and rigged in the phenomenology of spirit, is equivalent to not mathematization, but what is accomplished through having read the phenomenology of spirit once. I mean, how many times do you have to read it to kind of recognize the things that you're pointing out about that text? So too, in mathematical givens, things like pi. Again, if we had to run through the proofs the whole time, we would be doing a lot of talking, a lot of demonstration, but we wouldn't be doing any calculating, and in the analogous situation, we wouldn't be doing any thinking, nor could we lift our noses up from the text to even have a conversation about Hegel. Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, appreciate it.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to actually ask a question following Alenka's, because it seems quite related. I mean, to do with the difference between this sort of dilation of the phenomenology and the bad infinite, which it would otherwise just become this unending text. And this gets directly to the question of abbreviation and speed, because it's notable that after the phenomenology, he was able to produce a logic, but the original project was supposed to be huge, right? Logic was supposed to be the first, you know, he was supposed to do a philosophy of nature and a philosophy of spirit, and he never did that. What did he do? He gave the encyclopedia. So he just kind of, as if, and the encyclopedia, which is the circle of circles, is also the abridgment. I mean, it's giving you the whole thing without giving you the infinitesimal steps. It's not a work in motion, really. It itself functions as a diagram, point by point by point. So I just wanted to ask you to maybe expand on that a little bit, that Hegel cuts his own project short almost at the beginning, and just all the different economies of scale, because taking longer and taking shorter can't just be about taking more pages.
Isn't it true that Hegel sort of wrote parts of the Science of Logic during gymnasium teaching? I mean, this was some work that he derived from the classroom, presenting it to young people, let's say. The relationship between the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic, I take it that you mean, or the either logic, I think is exactly this point that Alenka and I are discussing. And I do think, on the one hand, it does represent the difference between deriving the proof of something like pi and then just writing the symbol of pi, and you know what it is in an instant, okay? On the other hand, the science of logic. Myself, I was very captivated by, I think like most of us are, those passages in the Doctrine of Essence on being and nothing and becoming. And I wouldn't want to take from the science of logic its own kind of expositional or dialectical or dilational quality. When I said to you last night I had been thinking about your paper the whole time since I've been at the conference, I was thinking about your remark, or your comment about the common remark that Hegel's text is like a novel, right? And then the other text to bring into this would be the aesthetics, which, when Hegel moves from art form to art form, he never ever leaves the other ones behind. It's not only that he starts with a description at the beginning of a new section of where we have been, but he's constantly referring to sculpture, to music, even to architecture, even in those passages hundreds of pages later on poetry. So the science of logic still has that sort of novelistic texture in the way I'm describing, as does the aesthetics. So I think Hegel doesn't give it up, but I do again see and agree that between the science of logic and the phenomenology of spirit, something is different is happening. And if we were to think about the phenomenology of spirit as a work of art, could you do that again? Like, think about it from the point of view of writing, or as what's called the project of writing. Could you really write another one of those?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Many things were amazing, many things new, and that's why I will try to catch up a little bit, and maybe we'll simplify the message of your talk to get the meaning better. Was your goal to show that the picture thinking and the topologizing condition is in fact the goal of dialectics that Hegel himself is unheeding? Because in the introduction to Phenomenology of Spirit, he quite explicitly claims that picture thinking is not, as well as geometry, is not compatible with the universal goals of self-consciousness and the development of spirit as it unfolds. So this is my question. Sorry for simplification.
It's not a simplification. In fact, what you have given is the answer. The answer to your question is yes. And I think that's the... No, thank you for it, but it's a similar thing. I mean, in the ways in which... It's like that last quotation I gave you. Hegel talks about logic. Don't fucking talk about geometry if you hate it so much. Just shut up about it, right? Every time he has to talk about it. What is that about? It's so easy for a symptomatic reading. Just the most vulgar kind of symptomatic reading would get you to thinking about that. So too, I mean, we're supposed to move beyond figurative thinking. Darstellung, not Vorstellung, right? That's all I ever hear. We can talk about it till you're blue in the face. That's what the whole project is the entire time. So I find it's the same kind of contradiction. If you don't want to talk about, it sounds like I'm quoting Marcuse in some strange way, this capitalism, fascism remark, but don't talk to me about figuration if you don't want to talk about geometry. Don't talk to me about Darstellung if you don't want to talk about Vorstellung as an authentic mode of representation in dialectics. So anyway, yes. Thank you.
Well, maybe I have probably a similar question. I mean, also dealing with the relationship between quantity and quality. And I guess one way of, to pose the question in one way would be, how you're understanding the difference between an aesthetic figure and a mathematical figure. I mean, because you began with a discussion of the aesthetics and then shifted into the mathematical figure as being exemplary. And what occurred to me in your talk was something that, a possible question would be Hegel's relationship to Plato and precisely the relation between dianoia and noesis in the divided line, and how for Plato, mathematics and geometry in particular is the introduction to philosophy. And why it seemed, at least the problem that your talk was posing, is why for Hegel aesthetics and precisely not geometry would be a more apt introduction to the highest form of philosophy, into the absolute. And so that would be my question. In other words, it's not that Hegel is not interested, obviously, in geometry and in calculus in particular, but it might be also precisely, I think also something you hinted at in the talk, would be precisely his understanding, which I think he thinks Kant doesn't grasp, which would be the difference precisely between the algebraic turn and the form of geometrical thinking that is distinctly Greek. But yeah, that would be my question.
That's interesting. I mean, hello, is this thing on? Yeah, on the one hand, and you see this in Kant as well, and it is in Hegel, this difference between Figur and Bild is a difference that we're not meant to just say, but that we're meant to think. And we lose the opportunity for that kind of thinking if we use one to kind of replace the other. When thinking about all this and looking back again on the aesthetics, and when realizing that we're in this moment of form, everyone's talking about form now. No? Well, yes, everyone's talking about form, right? The new formalism, forms of. Well, anyway, you read Hegel on this question of quantity and quality. The aesthetics feel to me, it's not only about the sensuous versus the non-sensuous, but again, about quality. The aesthetics feels to me that it's about quality. When I'm so used to thinking and approaching Hegel in relationship to the problems of form, which of course are very front and center in the scheme or the scheme of the arts. But what distinguishes the aesthetics is it's very content oriented. When I'm reading these passages in Hegel, when I'm quoting them, inner life, soul, right, spirit, all this. I mean, is this how you think about art? Right. That's the challenge of Hegel's aesthetics, is to think of it through that question, not of quantity and quality in some dialectical way, but of quality, front and center, like Silenus holding Bacchus.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. This was truly wonderful. Like simply getting to the gist of it, but, with the difference precisely between the figure and the concept, which is at the core of the concept, the non-concept at the core of the concept, and the necessary difference between the two. And if I get you right, the figure is the other of concept, of the dialectical thinking, but at the same time, the figure is far more dialectical than one assumes and imagines. So you have the pure, actually the difference between the two is a true dialectical difference. It's not a difference between non-dialectical and dialectical, but the non-dialectical itself turns out to be the very necessary thing for dialectics. Okay, I have some comments, and one goes back also to our conversation yesterday about the question of the Möbius strip, and I'm sorry I failed to send you this piece on Möbius strip. I'll do it today. I'll do it today.
Send me it.
Yes.
Email me.
Yeah, and this is the argument I tried to do was starting from a spot in the preface, the Phenomenology, which is a kind of strange spot, where Hegel for the only time says that the circle is eine nicht wundersame Verhältnis. It's not an admirable relation. It's not something to be respected or put in the highest place. So he actually, for once, expresses his dissatisfaction with the image of the circle. There's only one spot where he mentioned this. And this is where I had this idea that he lacked the proper figure for this, and this figure would be invented like 30 years on by Ferdinand Möbius, and this is the Möbius strip, which is maybe perfectly captures what Hegel wants to do, because it's one surface which is at each point based on a cut. And at all points, it's the opposition between the two opposite surfaces, which are one. So it's literally one splits into two. It's quite literally one splits into two. So it's a kind of topological device which maybe can solve or help us see better in this conundrum of circle of circles. How to imagine circle of circles. Maybe it's a Möbius strip. And incidentally, if my memory holds well, Ferdinand Möbius actually, he formulated this in 1860 or something. I mean, described this in his topological model. He was a direct descendant of Martin Luther. So there's a kind of strange conversation. Well, the second comment I want to make is on the question of the limit. And you have, in the logic, you have a very good passage where he makes the conceptual pair of die Grenze and die Schranke. So it's two different things, the border and the limit. I don't know what the English translation is exactly. And his point is very simple. Like, if you perceive something as die Grenze, as the border, you are within understanding. This is the logic of understanding. And you get to the logic of reason if you realize that to see something as the border, you have to be already beyond the border. You have crossed the border. You have conceptually already crossed the border. And this is the Schranke. And he has actually a wonderful sentence in the logic where he says, what is reason? It's to see a Schranke in jeder Grenze. So to treat every border as a limit. I mean, the limit that has already, either you see the limit that you cannot attain, and this is understanding, and the reason is just realizing the fact that to see this as a border, you have already passed it. So it's the surpassing of every, reason is the faculty of surpassing every border. There is no border. There are only like limits, which are the internal differences, but no border for reason. So this is my second comment, and the third comment is about Lacan, which you could have brought in, I mean, massively somehow, because Lacan is precisely the one who constantly uses these topological devices, and who at some point actually presented topological devices as an alternative to discourse. So he, in some seminars, in some late seminars, he literally kept silent and just drawing this strange knots and stuff, and all Klein's bottles, and all these mind-boggling topological things, which are literally unimaginable. I mean, you can only conceptually somehow conceive them. And he saw the topological thing as being on the par with the, well, words, words, words. You conceptualize by topology as well as you do by, it's a kind of alternative, which, I mean, it's not in contradiction for him, but it's an alternative. You can conceptualize just as well through figures. Okay.
Thank you for those very generative comments, and I'll just reply. I know that, you know, these may be tangents to the curve of your questions, but the Mobius strip, you know, what's interesting about that is again, I mean, we think of it as something that, you know, we associate with the name of Mobius, but it is also part of what it means to think in planar and hylomorphic surfaces. This is higher function, operational calculus. It comes from what we would see in kind of figurative representation, or what we would eat for breakfast as a donut or the torus with punctures and unfolding itself. The Mobius strip, in fact, is derived from the torus. And its relation, you know, and we only know that if we think mathematically. So the Mobius strip is, on the one hand, this very refreshing figure by which to think, I would say, abstract determination, the kind of distinction without a difference in this way, as you're describing it. But on the other hand, it is a figure that should lead to other figurative thoughts. And it too is a figure that pictures the movement of thought. I mean, the kind of, I mean, have you not looked at a Mobius strip? I wish I had one. No, I didn't bring one with me. You ever trace it with your finger when you look at a Mobius strip to try to follow the shape to see how it functions? If you didn't, yeah, who's going to admit that, right? But if you don't do that, you're not thinking figuratively, and you're not sort of taking advantage of what that figure can tell us. This thing about limits versus borders had me thinking about this question of bad infinity, and the sort of, you know, going on and on and on of a kind of infinite. I mean, maybe you won't like this answer, but the thing about infinity is that you can always find a point on it. I mean, we talk about infinity, but, you know, well, there's a number of ways of thinking about this. For one, you can think about the proposition that, say, you know, kind of wildly unimaginable numbers that only supercomputers can think, like the Googleplex, right? So a number that a supercomputer can think already contains or symbolizes a quantity that exceeds the hypothesized number of atoms in the known universe. We have numbers for that already. I'm not interested in thinking about infinity if we don't make that move about what we are thinking with extraordinarily powerful and high numbers. But when you're thinking about infinity, and this is what you learn in integral calculus, and the functions of calculus, is that bad infinity becomes good infinity anytime you name a point on the line or on the circle. It's a weird thing to think that math kind of freezes or unsticks or takes us out of bad infinity, and that's not what people mean when we talk about bad infinity. No one speaks of it in order to kind of recommend a mathematical operation. But I would remind one that the things that you can do with infinity are indeed thinkable and quantifiable, and aren't bad or false infinities. The thing with Lacan, I mean, this is the whole other issue. I mean, and this really brings us, and not just to Lacan, but just to his readers. I mean, you think of Althusser, you can think of just structuralism in general, but the role of the diagram the role of the figure in certain kinds of theory. Those before I ever heard of the Troika, I was reading, I didn't know what the fuck to make of Lacan. Like, just no idea. So thank you for that. But I remember reading Écrit in the late 80s and looking at those diagrams and just, what the fuck is that about? Like, that does not explain anything to me. What I have learned, and this was experience that started because Slavoy's, sublime object of ideology, kind of washed over everyone like a tidal wave, in theory, was the fact that Slavoj shows that those images, that those figures are in motion. And I think that's a very interesting thing to see. Althusser, Balibar in Reading Capital, when kind of diagramming and showing the structure of commodification, or even the formula for capital as MC M prime. I mean, come on, MC M prime. Where have I heard of M prime before? That is Archimedes. That's, this going through circulation and returning back to that starting point plus that surplus value. It's what distinguishes A from A prime. I mean, you can see this in geometrical texts, and you can think, again, on the one hand, you might think Marx isn't interested in doing this kind of geometry, but then you would be wrong, because his aim, as he says, and as Engels says in correspondence with Marx, is to produce a calculus that at once explains dialectics. This is a project that Marx intended to do. And I find that extraordinarily fascinating that he does this. But it is, again, to sort of the place of picturing and figuration in Lacan isn't some other to his thinking. It's actually what is supplementary to it and which also explains it.
Okay, thank you. Oh, all right.
But this would exactly. Thanks a lot for your paper. It just made me think about, again, dialectical image, that it is basically, we could think of image as builder, as figurations that are dialectical only if they contain something like logical time, because otherwise they could be linearly arrested and then illustrated in a bad way. So I think that's what you are hinting at, Mladen, with the Möbius strip. I mean, there is a certain logical time contained, which then, when we narrate that, we call it retroactivity, that we need. Then they are dialectical, so it's very minimal, but that's just my lesson I get from you, what you just said.
Thank you, Sammy. Here's the thing. I mean, your question is reminding me of the thing I never said, which is, dialectics narration, dialectics in time, temporality, temporal unfolding, all the rest. I alluded to this at the start of the paper, but Hegel thinks of figuration as not a question of time, but a question of space. And this isn't something I would suggest that dialectics isn't capable of conceptualizing. With apologies to my mentor, with apologies to a long tradition of trying to think about combined and uneven development, the idea of globalizing or the dialectic or thinking about world history in this way. But the limitations in thinking about a spatial dialectic are the result of this problem in Hegel, is what I'm suggesting. There is, as I alluded to, I think, and which is what I am, what you'll read about soon anyway in versions of this that are forthcoming, that there is a link between this kind of figurative thinking and what we're, again, as I refer to, what we would kind of vulgarly call kind of cognitive mapping, of discerning and figuring out our place within space, and to think about this in dialectical terms that is both properly sensuous, and also properly abstract. I still think that's an unfinished project. I still think a lot of work is to be done on that question. Thank you.
Okay, I know there are very many questions still left. This debate is far from exhausted, but but I will have to end it here. I would just like to make an announcement. We will continue at 2 o'clock, so make sure you eat properly, you rest properly, and come back here at 2 o'clock. And yes, please let's thank Andrew Cole for this wonderful presentation.